Me and a bunch of my friends come together regularly to play Crusader Kings 2 with the Game of Thrones mod, with a heavy emphasis on roleplay. This is an animated retelling of one of the stories that we spontaneously created in-game through our actions. And this is part 2. If you want to see how the war started and why each character chose the sides that they did, then check out part 1 in the description below this video. We are jumping straight into where we left off in part 1, so enjoy. Lord Arryn's chase of the Tully forces would come to an end when his scouts spotted a small Northman force encamped close to the ruins of Oldstone. The banners of House Bolton and Karstark were seen above. Lord Arryn did not hesitate and began his attack of the small northern host. He was still well aware of the nearby presence of Lord Blackwood's men, but he cared not, and pressed on. As battle commenced, the trap was sprung. From the west, the banners of Riverrun and Raventree Hall descended upon them, and from the east, the direwolf of Stark, as Harmond the Wolf joined the fray. The battle was a ruthless struggle, and again Lord Arryn found himself in the middle of the battle. He became separated from his knights and enveloped by savage Northmen from the Dreadfort. His horse fell beneath him, and the aged lord suffered many grievous wounds. However, death would elude him yet again as Daemon Royce broke the enemy around him with a savage charge of his knights. Lord Royce took over to try and salvage what was left of the Valeman forces into a retreat. The battle was a catastrophe. The forces of the Vale was devastated. When word reached King Maekar, he was said to have paled with fear. Princess Vera had successfully retreated within the walls of the Twins, and the rebels had now combined a significant force at Oldstone, with the remaining royal host of King Maekar now split by the Trident. The trick had dawned upon him. Maekar, now fearful that his forces would be defeated one by one, quickly retreated down the King's Road, in hopes of uniting with the Tyrells before they too could be struck. However, the Tyrells were not the intended target of the rebels. Yet again the king fell into a trap. The rebel forces had marched past the Tyrells sieging Riverrun and blocked the path for the king. Yet, here some confusion arose. The rebels were surprised by Maekar's swift march south. They had expected him to maintain his assault upon his aunt. Therefore, now they wrongly assumed he was fleeing to the Vale of Arryn to avoid being trapped. So they decided to cross the Trident, catch him before the gates of the moon. This, however, was incorrect. King Maekar was aware he could retreat to the Vale, but he saw that as a defeat. But the rebel host, having crossed the Trident intending on blocking the wrong path, provided him with an opportunity. The rebels had abandoned the defendable positions upon the river, and the bold young king spotted a chance to escape. He led a charge of his vanguard against the enemy while the rest of his men marched south towards the Trident. However, due to the efficient scouting of Lord Karstark, they spotted his movement and his plan. This meant that far more men than intended had to be committed to keep the rebels at bay. This, plus the brilliant chasing action of Lord Blackwood, led to enormous casualties for the Loyalist army. Yet the plan succeeded. Despite heavy casualties, Maekar had crossed the river and was escaping towards Riverrun. Maekar left Lord Darry to delay the rebels' crossing, yet once they passed this minor inconvenience, they did not make chase. The rebel camp was now at an impasse. Despite their recent victory, they had failed to land a decisive blow they sought, and now two options stood before them: to chase Maekar or to take King's Landing. Lord Harmond Stark advocated to chase the king.
If we make haste, we may still catch him before Riverrun. And even if not, we must fight the Royalist army one day, and better soon, for time is not on our side. More Loyalists may still be brought from the south, Dorne, the Stormlands. Even the Reach has not sent all its might. The throne is but a chair, one the Queen can plant her arse on later. The war will only end one way: the death of the Mad King's spawn. And the sooner the better.
Spawns, my lord. Plural, countered Jeremy Blackwood.
Maekar has a brother, who rules as Hand and Regent in King's Landing. If we kill Maekar, Amos will simply crown Valar. And as you say, Valar may raise another army from the south, to avenge his brother. No, my lord, we must march upon King's Landing, while it lays undefended. If we seize all the symbols of the crown and place them upon Vera, it will give her the aura of legitimacy she sorely needs. The Stormlords and Dornish have no love for the king, and it could still be her who raises a new army from the south. Besides, if we capture Valar in the process, Maekar might just surrender outright to save his baby brother.
Lord Blackwood, along with some of the strongest of the Riverlords, decided to march upon King's Landing, and though he voiced sound reasonings, his true purpose was to save his beloved childhood friend Elmar Tully from the dungeons of the Red Keep, even at the cost of Lady Derva and Riverrun. No agreement could be met, so the rebels decided to set up camp and await the arrival of their queen, who was making her way from the Twins with reinforcements. Upon arrival, her decision was swift. She cared not to save her mother-in-law in Riverrun, so the rebel host began its march south along the King's Road, straight for the King's Landing. Meanwhile, Maekar arrived at the siege of Riverrun, where Lord Tarly stood in command of the Tyrell host. He had not been idle. The camp was fortified, the siege towers and battering rams were under construction. Lord Tarly was eager to see blood and assault the walls of Riverrun. Yet, when word reached him of the rebels' movements, the king had different thoughts in mind. The war, which he initially thought would be easy, had turned against him due to their rash decisions and bold strategies. The king was now leaning on the teachings of Lord Amos, and was resting on the side of caution. The siege of Riverrun was already well underway, and Maekar had left King's Landing with a mighty garrison and well supplied. He believed Riverrun would fall long before King's Landing. Therefore, he believed that time was on his side. Additionally, Shireen was winning in the Stormlands, and would soon be free to send him more men. The king believed he could take Riverrun and Lady Derva, making many, if not all, of the Riverlords surrender and abandon the siege of King's Landing. Then he could descend upon the remaining rebels from two fronts, ending the war. Thus the loyalist host decided against storming the walls and settled in for a lengthy siege. Back at King's Landing, the young prince and hand of the king Valar had at first left much of the day-to-day to the council, but as the war turned sour, he became more distrustful. He began taking more direct rulership and proved himself a poor regent. If the councillors cautioned against his decisions, he had them sacked, believing them in league with the rebels. And when he heard the rebels were marching against him, he shut all the gates many weeks in advance, refusing fresh supplies in fear of spies. But it was neither spies nor rebel queens who reached his gates first. A few days before the arrival of the rebel host, the sun-spare of House Martell was spotted in the distance. Princess Valena of Dawn had sent her uncle, Oliver Martell, to break away from the Stormlands with 8,000 men and reinforce King's Landing. But as he arrived, the gates remained shut. The young Prince Valar remembered when he was young, and it was the sun-spare who threatened his life. He refused to open his gates, demanding the Dornish men march and fight the rebels alone to prove their loyalty. The Dornish prince showed no emotions to this, yet he was determined to follow the command of his princess and prove her loyalty true. So the Dornish host marched north. The rebels were more than 4 times their number. Everyone knew this was a fool's errand, but there was no convincing Prince Valar. The Dornish gave a valiant effort, their spearmen even holding their ground against the charge of the rebel vanguard, but they were soon overrun, all dead, captured or scattered into the wind. A few men who successfully regrouped under Prince Martell did not return to King's Landing. He had done his due in the name of his princess, and he had no intentions of bowing before the gate and hoping for the crown's mercy to let him in. The valiant yet futile stand of the Dornish would go into song and legend, but it made no difference for King's Landing as the rebel host began their siege. 7 months into their siege, King Maekar led a splinter force of 6,000 men northeast to take Stonehenge, the seat of House Bracken. After the Battle of the Blackwood Vale, Lord Jammos Bracken had failed to regroup with the rest of the Riverlords, refusing to follow the orders of Lord Blackwood. He returned instead to Stonehenge, where he had rested for the rest of the war, yet refused to disband his men, nor lower the banners of the Queen. Shortly after his arrival, Lord Bracken sent out his sons to negotiate. After just 2 weeks of sieging the castle, he yielded. rose the banners of King Maekar and gave its levies to his cause. Maekar had now bolstered his cause with a couple thousand more rivermen. Yet unbeknownst to Maekar, his actions of leaving the siege of Riverrun would have dire consequences. As the king marched back to Riverrun, dire news reached him from Lord Tarly. Thousands of men were descending from the mountain passes. The West had come. When the war began, Lord Kevin Reyne of the Westerlands was on Aldwick, fighting a campaign to retrieve his ancestral sword, Red Rain, which had fallen into the hands of the Ironborn long ago. He had just won a major battle against Raymar Drum and was chasing the Ironborn into his castle. He had few relations to either Queen nor King. However, when Derva Tully sent out her ravens calling for aid as well, he was torn. Kevin would rather stay out of the conflict, but he owed the aged Lady of Riverrun a deep ancestral debt. For it was in fact her who had saved his grandfather and dynasty from the death and utter ruin at the hands of Tywin Lannister. If not for her, he would not be alive and would not be the ruler of the Westerlands. He wanted to help, but he was bogged down against the Ironborn. He had no choice. He had to finish his campaign and demand the complete surrender of House Drum and its allies to be able to return. His Castellan, however, did not sit idle during his lord's absence. Kevin had set sail with half the strength of the West, but when war began in the Riverlands, Lord Crakehall summoned the remaining half to gather at the Golden Tooth to defend the Westlands and ward off attacks. Kevin's war in the Iron Islands is his own interesting story for another time, but he would ultimately reach complete victory, reclaiming his sword and ensuring safe passage back to the Westlands. He had expected grim news upon his return, yet once he landed in the Westerlands, he had heard of how the war had turned, and marched swiftly to combine his strength to that of Lord Crakehall. And along with a minor force of rivermen who had split off from the siege of King's Landing, he descended from the Golden Tooth with more than 30,000 men, the largest host still remaining in the war. King Maekar marched swiftly towards Riverrun with his small host. Though the Lion outnumbered him, with the new Bracken reinforcements, their strength were nearly even. Yet, when Maekar arrived at Riverrun, he saw only horror. Fire and death laid across the fields, the tumbleweed ran red with blood, and ruinous siege engines laid broken and drowned along the walls of Riverrun. In Maekar's absence, Lord Tarly had launched an assault upon the walls of Riverrun. His reasoning was that they could not meet the Lion in the field before they secured their backs by seizing the castle. Yet, he had caused naught but ruin, as the blue and red banners of House Tully still flew proud upon the battlements, and the loyalist host had now lost thousands of men in their assault. The king's army was now closer to 20,000, rather than 30 as it was before. Maekar was distraught. He had enemies to his west, north and east. His bannermen counselled him to break away south to repeat what he did at the Trident. South? What is there south? The Dornish gave away what little they had left at King's Landing, and the Stormlords still tear each other apart. Besides, the clever Black Stag gave her course to mine when the rebel course seemed hopeless. Now I can hope for nothing but smooth words from her, I'm sure. And of my foster father, Amos? Where is he as my reign is being brought to ruin? It is true he has sent me many swords, yet clearly not a single man with wit. He sits at the citadel and reads, as I fail at every turn. My lords, you wish for me to repeat the Trident? I would rather forget it. You speak of it as a triumph, and though it is true we avoided being trapped, we lost what little hope remained of a decisive victory. When I marched from King's Landing, victory was a foregone conclusion, yet blunder after blunder has whittled away our enormous advantage in swords. The Trident was the final straw. Breaking away will lose us more men than we can ever hope to regain in the south. No, my lords, this is where we shall make or break this war. Victory has been achieved against greater odds than this. We will face the Westerman host head on. And so it was. Despite his disadvantage in numbers, he left a token force at Riverrun and marched to face this new threat. A decisive victory here and the war could be turned around. The battle was vicious and bloody. The king was outnumbered, but he had picked an advantageous field of battle, with hills and trees to his advantage, limiting the use of numbers by his enemies. Yet, Though his men and generals were experienced and battle-hardened, so were the Westermen from their campaign in the Iron Isles. Both sides held their ground and the battle turned into a meat grinder. Thousands of men were lost on both sides, yet too many Westermen laid in reserve, and the king was forced to yield the field and retreat to avoid utter ruin. His token force at Riverrun had been shattered by the defender's sortie, and he was forced into a retreat northeast, back to the Trident, Lord Kevin hot on his trail. Yet this time Maekar fared better in his retreat. Lord Hightower, the new commander of the Tyrell forces, led a brilliant rearguard action, and thus the king escaped safely across the river, where he met none other than his friend, Lord Paramount John Arryn of the Vale. He had mostly recovered from his injuries and had raised another host to rejoin the fight. The men he brought had not been enough to recover their losses, nor enough to match the strength of the West, but it was enough to give the king renewed hope. He stopped his retreat and made up positions upon the Trident, awaiting his enemy. Kevin arrived a few days later but did not make the crossing. He too took up positions and held. Both sides sat down and waited to see what the others would do. One night after it became obvious that the Westermen would not strike, the king held a council to see what to do next. He stood before a familiar dilemma.
"Retreat!" Lord Hightower proclaimed. "We still do not match their number, despite the timely arrival of Lord Arryn. And while they stand upon the banks of the Trident, they may as well be manning the walls of Riverrun again for how much good an assault would do us across it. If we could reach the Vale, then no army will catch us past your mighty gates. Isn't that correct, Lord Arryn?"
"What? No, fuck that,"
the offensively Scottish Lord of the Vale replied. To no one's surprise, he wanted to charge the enemy. King Maekar felt hopeless. Attacking over the river with inferior numbers would be foolish. Yet even if they could make it to the Vale and find ships to ferry them away, where would they land? Anywhere in the Crownlands would be too close to the enemy to consolidate. Dawn and the Reach was way too far. King's Landing would fall before they ever could get there. And the Stormlands? The king would rather sink than trust the warm embrace of the Black Stag in her safe harbours. More pressingly, he feared for his brother. "I cannot let him fall into the hands of our aunt. She will kill him to secure her claim. My lords, I have no choice but to cross. Make ready. We strike at dawn." Yet, as Maekar readied his champions to lead the vanguard upon the brink of morning, he was surprised to see the enemy were already crossing. More still, not with bloodied spears, but with a white banner of treaty. A trap, a Kingsguard snared, but Maekar thought not so. Why trap when they have all the advantage? Maekar went in person to treat with the emissaries, who were none other than Lord Kevin Reyne and Lady Derva Tully in person. Unknown to the king, the situation in King's Landing had deteriorated. With isolation and starvation, Prince Valar's paranoia had descended into outright madness. The heads of prisoners and trusted advisors alike were being flung from the walls at the besiegers, and the queen had made no efforts to negotiate for her husband's safe release. Lady Derva had been trapped behind the walls of Riverrun. The last news she had gained before the Tyrell siege camp was raised was that her second son was dead and their army defeated in the Blackwood. She had seen no hope of negotiating. Yet, ever the diplomat, and now that she had learned the war had turned so greatly in her favour, she wanted to seize the chance to end the madness. "All I want is my son, my only son. Too much has been lost in this bloodshed, and even in victory I see no hope for my family. Your Grace, if you promise my son's safe return, and the pardons of all crimes, imaginary or otherwise, done by me, my family and the Westmen, and any others who are willing to bend the knee and surrender, then we shall do as such. We will step aside, give you leave to King's Landing, to save my son and your brother from your aunt." Maekar looked to Lord Reyne, whose host stood proud like a lion across the river.
"I am here at the Eagle's command, your grace. Not the queen, who I know not. If Derva beckons me, then you shall pass, and I shall return to Castamere as your servant once more."
These were better terms than he could ever have hoped for. Though it hurt him greatly having to pardon traitors who not long ago tried to have him killed, he did so swiftly. Kevin let the king pass, though he did not go far. He travelled to Harrenhal to await the return of Elmar Tully, ready still to strike the capital if the king was not to be faithful to his words. Derva Tully sent word to the rivermen in the queen's army. She commanded them to leave the queen's side, which they obeyed, as even Lord Blackwood now feared he had made the wrong choice, seeing as the queen cared not for her husband within the dungeons of the Red Keep. The queen was now trapped. With the rivermen and westermen having abandoned her cause, she was now surrounded, and her battered Northmen that remained to her through Lord Stark could not match the numbers of the loyalists now. Yet she had nowhere to run, so she made her stand. King Maekar descended upon her, while the starved defenders of the city tried desperately to assist with their own sortie. Yet despite their number advantage, the loyalist host was a mismatch of Crownlanders, Rivermen, Valemen and Reachmen, battered from many defeats. Her hardy Northmen may still have won the day if not for the arrival of the Black Stag and her army of raving Stormlanders. The queen was captured, her army crushed, and the rebellion was defeated. King Maekar did not hesitate. He had the rebel queen beheaded immediately upon her capture. He would from that day onwards be known as a kinslayer. Many of his bannermen, his brother Valar and friend Jon Arryn amongst them, urged him to go against the treaty that was signed upon the Trident, claiming that traitors had no honour to treat with to begin with, saying he should keep Elmar and crush the rebels in battle. Maekar, on the other hand, knew there was no hope for such. Kevin rested way too close to the capital and his forces was far too strong. Even if Maekar wanted to betray his words, he did not have the strength to pull through. He kept his words. He pardoned all traitors who surrendered and released Elmar back to Harrenhal. What little remained of the young lord at least, for he had been tortured and starved. They say his mind would forever be lost in the black cells of the Red Keep. Now, what was the result of all this bloodshed? Like with most wars between lords of the land, there was little to be gained. The rebel queen Vera was beheaded. She would be the last real threat to Maekar's reign. The only rebel who could be said to have gained anything was Lady Derva, who saw the return of her son and heir Elmar, but she paid for it with the life of her youngest son, Lyle Tully. And Elmar would never be the same again. He lost his mind in the Black Cells, and his body never recovered neither. His life would be riddled with illness and disease. Yet, just like his time in the Black Cells, he endured, never succumbing to any of his ailments, even his battle with cancer. Therefore, he would gain the nickname the Resilient, until his death of natural causes in 344 AC in Riverrun. The same could not be said about Kevan Rayne, who did receive a foul wound in his only battle of the war. His injuries festered and he was plagued with illness and disease until he succumbed to them just a year after the war, in 323 AC. Additionally, his line almost ended as the Great Plague of 324 AC ravaged his family, killing all of his 7 children and most of his grandchildren, leaving the West in control of a regency council to the young girl of the West. Harmon Stark, the Wolf, bent the knee in the aftermath of the final battle to King Maekar. He would return to Winterfell until his death to cancer in 354 AC. On the side of the Loyalists, the king would end up living the longest of all the participants of the war. But he would not get the prosperous reign he sought aside from his youth. For though he had now killed the last true threat to his reign, the lands would still suffer plague and minor revolts throughout his long life. He would spend most of his years in the saddle, rather than in King's Landing, still trying to clean the stain of his father, until his death of natural causes in the year 368 AC, 45 years after the rebellion. Prince Valar would never recover. He would remain in his brother's hand, but his paranoia festered and his actions against perceived threats would cause more revolts than they stopped, until his death of cancer in 363 AC. Of the king's allies, Jon Arryn took it upon himself to hunt down deserters, robber barons and the remaining rebel holdouts within the Riverlands. A last-ditch attempt to find the glorious death he so craved. Alas, it would still escape him. He returned to the Vale some 9 months after the war, where he remained. His friendship with the king now estranged from both of their actions during the war. He would never again get the chance for death in battle, and he committed suicide only a few years later. Shireen the Black Stag of Storm's End died of complication of gout only a few days after the pretended queen's death. Her son began a tyrannical rule, leaving the Stormlands plagued with wars and rebellion for many years to come. Prince Olyvar Martell succumbed to his wounds after returning to Dawn, but before he was able to see his princess again. And his niece, Princess Valena, would suffer plots and conspirators her whole life, and would ultimately be assassinated in 337 AC. Amos Tyrell, the theologian, the man who had ended the reign of the Mad King Jaenar and spent the following years as regent, rebuilding the realm from the chaos, would continue to live a long and prosperous life after the war. His lands alone were spared from the many battles and revolts of Maekar's reign, and though he was forever loyal to his foster child, he long separated himself from the rulings of the realm. Though many would whisper and wish that Amos did not stop with the Mad King, and instead continued his regency past Maekar. Alas, Amos the Theologian passed away in 359 AC after an extended period in a coma. And thus, our story ends. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. This was my first ever attempt at an animated story like this, so please give me feedback on what you think. Firstly, I already know it was way too much work making it as detailed as I did. By making the video from an in-lore kind of perspective, I ended up making it way too long, and I ended up adding fluff and padding to fill out details and to justify actions that may not have made sense on its own, or to explain what the AI did, or like game mechanics through a story perspective. This made the video much longer than it had to be, and created way too much work for me. I think if I do this again, I will make the script out of character, and just accept that it's a game at the end of the day, and explain things more straightforward. But if you enjoyed the overall concept, then please tell me, because I may end up making more, and hopefully improve as I go. But yeah, thanks for watching. See ya.